Sophie Reed had perfected the art of being invisible. It was a survival skill, really. One she'd honed over years of serving champagne to people who looked through her like she was made of glass. Tonight was no different. The Vance Foundation Gala glittered with old money and new power, a symphony of silk gowns and custom tuxedos, of laughter that cost more than her rent. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across marble floors so polished she could see her own reflection. A ghost in a white shirt and black vest, carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres no one would remember eating. She moved through the crowd like water, fluid and unremarkable, her smile plastered on, her feet screaming in the cheap heels she'd bought at a discount store. The medical bills from her mother's final year sat in a shoebox under her bed. Each one a small knife twist of guilt and grief. $53,000. The number haunted her dreams, turned every shift into a desperate calculation. How many trays? How many smiles? How many years until she could breathe again? But tonight wasn't about her debt. Tonight was about surviving until midnight, collecting her paycheck and going home to her studio apartment where the heat barely worked and the neighbors fought through thin walls. She was refilling her tray at the service station when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong in this carefully orchestrated evening. A child's whimper, high and distressed, cutting through the Mozart quartet and polite conversation like a siren. Sophie's head snapped up. There, near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, a small boy sat hunched on the floor. His hands pressed over his ears, his face contorted in silent agony. He couldn't have been more than 6, drowning in a tiny designer suit that probably cost more than her car. The sounds of the gala, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the string quartet, seemed to press down on him like physical weight. And standing 3 feet away, scrolling through her phone with bored indifference, was a woman in an expensive navy dress. The nanny, Sophie realized. Hired help, just like her, but the kind who wore Prada and didn't care. Something inside Sophie's chest cracked open. She knew that look on the boy's face. She'd seen it on her younger brother before he'd learned to cope, before therapy and understanding had given him tools. She'd seen it in the mirror on her worst days, when the world was too loud and too bright and too much. Her feet moved before her brain caught up. She set down her tray, her manager's inevitable fury a distant concern, and crossed the ballroom floor. The crowd parted around her like she didn't exist, their superpower and hers. Sophie knelt beside the boy, careful not to touch him, and reached into her apron pocket. Her fingers closed around the small fabric pouch she always carried, her secret, her shame, her hope. Inside were 3 fidget toys she'd made herself. A smooth river stone wrapped in soft flannel, a braided cord with wooden beads, and a small sensory square with different textures on each side. She pulled out the stone and placed it on the floor between them, within his line of sight, but not in his space. The boy's eyes flickered open, still glassy with overwhelm, and locked onto the object. Sophie didn't speak. Words would be too much right now. Instead, she picked up the stone and ran her thumb over its smooth surface in a slow, rhythmic pattern. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. A heartbeat. An anchor. The boy's breathing began to slow. She set the stone down again, closer this time, and waited. After an eternity compressed into 30 seconds, a small hand reached out and touched it. His thumb mimicked her movement. 1, 2, 3. Sophie felt her own breath release. She pulled out the braided cord and began to run it through her fingers, the repetitive motion hypnotic and soothing. The boy watched, transfixed, his hands slowly lowering from his ears. The world didn't go quiet. The gala still roared around them. But somehow, in their small bubble of silence, it didn't matter anymore. Sophie smiled, soft and genuine. and the boy's lips twitched in something that might, in another moment, become a smile back. She didn't know she was being watched. Kalen Vance stood 30 feet away, a glass of scotch forgotten in his hand, and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He'd been scanning the room with the cold efficiency of a man who turned his inheritance into an empire. Unseen heir to the Vance fortune, visible face of Vance Dynamics. Looking for investors to charm and competitors to intimidate. The gala was a carefully orchestrated performance, one he'd perfected over 15 years of clawing his way to the top. Smile, handshake, small talk, close the deal, repeat. But his attention kept snagging on his son. Leo had been struggling all evening, his small body rigid with tension in the suit Kalen's mother had insisted he wear. "He needs to learn to adapt," she'd said, her voice crisp with disapproval. "You coddle him too much." Kalen had hired the best nanny money could buy, a woman with impeccable credentials and a resume that read like a PhD thesis. She'd lasted 3 weeks before giving her notice, citing challenging behavioral issues. The woman he'd hired to replace her tonight was supposedly a specialist, recommended by his mother's social circle. She was currently ignoring his son's meltdown to text someone. Rage, familiar and acidic, flooded Kalen's throat. He was already moving toward them, ready to fire her on the spot and carry Leo out of this circus himself, when he saw her. A waitress. Young, slender, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She moved with purpose, cutting through his guests like they were ghosts, and knelt beside his son with a grace that made his breath catch. Kalen froze, every instinct screaming at him to intervene. Leo didn't do well with strangers. Leo needed space, needed quiet, needed... His son reached for something in the woman's hand. Kalen's heart stopped. He watched, paralyzed, as the waitress created a small miracle on his ballroom floor. She didn't touch Leo, didn't overwhelm him with questions or false cheer. She simply offered him something, a stone, and showed him what to do with it. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost meditative. And Leo responded. His son, who'd been nonverbal for 3 days after his mother had abandoned them with a vicious parting shot about damaged goods and public spectacles, was engaging with a complete stranger. Not just tolerating her presence, actually connecting with her. The tightness in Kalen's chest loosened for the first time in months. He studied the waitress with the intensity he usually reserved for quarterly reports and hostile takeovers. She wasn't classically beautiful, not like the models and socialites who regularly threw themselves at his wealth. But there was something luminous about her. Something genuine in the soft curve of her smile as she watched Leo explore the objects she'd given him. She cared. Not because she was paid to, not because it looked good, but because she actually, truly gave a damn about a child she'd never met. When was the last time anyone had looked at Leo like that? When was the last time anyone had looked at Kalen himself like he was more than a bank account with a pulse? "Sir?" His assistant, Marcus, appeared at his elbow, tablet in hand. "The Japanese delegation is ready for your meeting." Kalen didn't look away from the waitress. "Who is she?" Marcus blinked. "Sir?" "The waitress, with my son. I want her name, her address, her employment history. Everything." His voice came out harder than he intended, the tone he used in boardrooms when he wanted something and wouldn't accept no for an answer. Yes, sir. Right away." Kalen finally tore his gaze away and gestured toward the hired nanny, who'd finally noticed the situation and was hurrying over with a simpering expression. "And fire her. Immediately. She's done." As he walked toward the Japanese delegation, forcing his face into a pleasant mask, his mind was already 3 steps ahead. He needed that waitress. Leo needed her. The connection she'd made in 5 minutes was something a dozen expensive specialists hadn't managed in 6 months. He would make her an offer she couldn't refuse. It's what he did. It's what he was good at. Money solved problems. Money bought solutions. He ignored the small voice in the back of his mind that whispered this woman might be different. That some things couldn't be bought, only earned. Kaylin Vance didn't fail. He adapted. He conquered. And he would have her. Sophie didn't see the man watching her from across the room as she slowly stood, leaving the toys with Leo. The boy was calmer now, his breathing even, his fingers working the braided cord with focused intensity. The nanny finally swooped in, all false concern and fluttering hands. "Oh, Leo, sweetheart, are you all right? I was just..." Sophie stepped back, making herself invisible again. It was easier than confronting the woman's negligence, easier than making a scene. She retrieved her tray and slipped back into the current of servers, her heart still racing from the encounter. She didn't let herself think about the boy, about whether he'd be okay, about whether anyone in this glittering world actually saw him. Some people, she'd learned, were born invisible, and some people chose it because being seen was too dangerous, too expensive, too heartbreaking. Sophie Reed had chosen invisibility a long time ago. She had no idea it was about to be stripped away. The knock came at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning, shattering the silence of Sophie's studio apartment like a gunshot. She'd been awake for hours, unable to sleep after her shift. Hunched over her tiny kitchen table with a pile of fabric scraps and a half-finished sensory blanket she'd never be able to sell. The gala had been 2 days ago. She'd collected her paycheck, survived her manager's lecture about abandoning her station, and tried to forget the small boy with the haunted eyes. She hadn't succeeded. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Sophie shuffled to the door in her threadbare pajama pants and an oversized sweater that had been her mother's. She didn't bother checking the peephole, probably her landlord, early with another complaint about noise or late rent. She opened the door and froze. The man from the gala stood in her hallway. He was even more devastating up close. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that looked artfully disheveled and eyes the color of storm clouds. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her yearly income, and he filled her doorway like he owned it, like he owned everything he looked at. Recognition slammed into her. This was him, the host, the man who'd been watching her with Leo. Sophie Reed? His voice was deep, controlled, with an edge that suggested he wasn't used to being denied anything. Yes? Her hand tightened on the doorframe. Kaylin Vance. He extended a hand, and she shook it on autopilot. His grip was firm, warm, and sent an unwelcome jolt of awareness up her arm. May I come in? How did you find me? The question came out sharper than intended, fear spiking through her confusion. Your employer provided your information. He said it like it was the most natural thing in the world, like privacy was just another commodity to be purchased. I have a business proposition for you. May I? He gestured toward her apartment, and Sophie became acutely aware of the peeling paint, the mismatched furniture from thrift stores, the sensory toys scattered across every surface like evidence of a secret life. She should say no. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door in his handsome, entitled face. Instead, she stepped aside. Kaylin Vance entered her tiny world, and it immediately felt smaller, the air thinner. He didn't belong here among her second-hand dreams and bargain bin survival. He was custom-made Italian leather in a world of scuffed linoleum. His gaze swept the apartment with clinical efficiency, cataloging everything. And Sophie felt herself flush with shame and defiance in equal measure. You make these? He picked up one of her fidget cubes from the table. turning it over in his hands with surprising gentleness. It's just a hobby. The lie tasted bitter. These are excellent, professional quality. He set it down and turned to face her fully, and the weight of his attention was almost physical. I'll be direct, Ms. Reed. I need you. Her stomach flipped. Excuse me? For my son, Leo. Something flickered in his eyes. Vulnerability, quickly shuddered. What you did at the gala, no one else has been able to reach him like that. Not therapists, not specialists, not the parade of nannies I've hired and fired over the past 6 months. Sophie's defenses rose. I'm not a nanny. I don't have training, or I don't care about credentials. He cut her off with the impatience of a man used to controlling conversations. I care about results. You connected with him in 5 minutes. That's what I need. That's what he needs. Mr. Vance, the position would be full-time. You'd live in my home, be available for Leo whenever he needs you. The salary is $200,000 a year, plus benefits, plus a signing bonus of $50,000. The number hit her like a physical blow. $200,000. The medical debt that haunted her dreams, gone in 4 months. The business she'd fantasized about, suddenly possible. It was too much. It was insane. Why? She whispered. For the first time, his controlled mask cracked, and she saw the desperation underneath. Because I'm failing him. Every day, I watch my son struggle in a world that doesn't understand him, and I can't fix it. I can buy him anything, give him everything, but I can't give him what you did. Peace, understanding, connection. He stepped closer, and she could smell his cologne, expensive and subtly intoxicating. Name your price, Ms. Reed, whatever it takes. Sophie's mind raced. This was wrong. This was a fairy tale, and fairy tales didn't happen to girls like her. Men like Kaylin Vance didn't show up at broken-down apartments offering salvation. But God, she needed it. The money. The chance. The escape from the endless cycle of debt and desperation. I need to think about it, she managed. You have until tomorrow morning. After that, I'll find someone else. He pulled a business card from his pocket and set it on her table. Call me with your answer. He moved toward the door, and Sophie felt the moment slipping away, felt the chance evaporating like morning mist. Wait. The word escaped before she could stop it. He turned, one eyebrow raised in question. Sophie straightened her spine, channeling every ounce of dignity she possessed. If I agree, this would be strictly professional. I'd be there for Leo, not... She faltered, heat flooding her cheeks. Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something darker, hungrier. Of course. No. She forced herself to hold his gaze. You need to understand. I have a personal rule. My intimacy is reserved for my husband. This would be a professional arrangement only. Nothing more. The silence stretched between them, taut and electric. Kaylin's expression was unreadable, but she saw his jaw tighten, saw something flash in his eyes that made her pulse race. When he spoke, his voice was rough, barely controlled. I'm hiring you for my son, Ms. Reed, not for anything else. I needed to be clear. You've been crystal clear. He opened the door, then paused, looking back at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. For what it's worth, I respect your principles. Not many people have them anymore. Then he was gone, leaving Sophie alone in her apartment with a business card, an impossible offer, and the feeling that her carefully invisible life had just been irrevocably shattered. Kaylin sat in the back of his town car, his hands clenched into fists on his thighs, and tried to remember how to breathe normally. Her rule, her goddamn rule. He should be relieved. This made everything cleaner, simpler. A business transaction. He was hiring her for Leo, nothing more. The attraction he felt, the pull that had him tracking down a waitress and showing up at her door like some obsessed stalker, was irrelevant. Except it wasn't irrelevant. It was burning through his carefully constructed control like acid. He'd noticed everything in that tiny apartment. The way her sweater had slipped off one shoulder, revealing a delicate collarbone. The way she'd crossed her arms defensively, which only served to draw attention to curves she clearly didn't know she had. The way her dark eyes had flashed with defiance when she'd stated her rule, like she expected him to laugh or dismiss her. As if he could dismiss her. As if he could think about anything else. Reserved for her husband. The words echoed in his mind, and something primal and possessive stirred in his chest. The idea of Sophie Reed, married to some faceless man, made him want to put his fist through a wall. Which was insane. He didn't do jealousy. He didn't do obsession. He bought what he wanted, used it efficiently, and moved on. But Sophie Reed wasn't a company to acquire or a deal to close. She was something else entirely. Something dangerous and necessary, and completely outside his control. "Sir?" His driver's voice interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Where to?" Kalen closed his eyes and saw Leo's face at the gala, transformed by Sophie's quiet presence. Saw the gentle competence in her hands as she'd shown his son how to self-soothe. Saw the genuine care in her expression, no artifice, no calculation. Leo needed her. That was what mattered. Everything else, his inconvenient attraction, her maddening rule, the way she'd looked at him like he was both dangerous and fascinating, was secondary. He would control this. He controlled everything. "Home," he said finally. "And Marcus? Clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. I'll be receiving an important call." He'd made her an offer she couldn't refuse. She was drowning in debt. He'd seen the stack of medical bills on her table, the past due notices she'd tried to hide. She needed him as much as he needed her. It was just business. He repeated that to himself all the way home, and tried to ignore the voice that whispered he was lying. Sophie called the next morning at 8 o'clock sharp. "I accept your offer, Mr. Vance, but I have conditions." Even through the phone, her voice sent heat down his spine. Kalen leaned back in his office chair, a smile playing at his lips. "I'm listening. I want a contract. Clear boundaries, clear expectations. And I want confirmation that my role is companion and caregiver, not servant. I won't be fetching your dry cleaning or organizing your social calendar." Strong. Principled. Unafraid to negotiate even when she held no cards. God, she was magnificent. "Agreed. My assistant will have the contract drawn up by this afternoon. Anything else?" A pause. Then, softer, "I want to meet Leo properly, before I move in. I need to make sure he's comfortable with me." Something in Kalen's chest loosened. She wasn't doing this for the money, or at least, not only for the money. She genuinely cared about his son's well-being. "This afternoon, 2 o'clock, I'll send a car. I can take the subway." "I'll send a car, Ms. Reed." He gentled his tone. "Consider it part of the job. You're mine now." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with unintended meaning. "I'm Leo's," she corrected quietly. "Not yours." The line went dead. Kalen set down his phone and stared out at the Manhattan skyline, his reflection ghostly in the floor-to-ceiling windows. Reserved for her husband. He was hiring her for Leo. This was about his son. Nothing else mattered. He told himself that for the rest of the day, and almost believed it. 1 week later, Sophie stood in the kitchen of Kalen's penthouse, her hands trembling as she gripped the counter, and tried to remember how to breathe. The past 7 days had been a whirlwind of adjustment and discovery. She'd moved into the tastefully decorated guest suite on the opposite end of the massive penthouse from Kaylin's master bedroom, a detail that hadn't escaped her notice. She'd learned Leo's routines, his triggers, his small joys. She'd discovered that he loved soft textures and hated bright lights, that he was brilliant with patterns and could spend hours watching snow globes, that he trusted her in a way that made her chest ache with protective tenderness. And she'd learned that living under the same roof as Kaylin Vance was a special kind of torture. He was everywhere and nowhere. Present for breakfast with Leo, disappearing into his home office for conference calls, emerging for dinner with that controlled intensity that made her hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. He watched her with his son. Watched her constantly, actually, with an expression she couldn't read but felt in her bones. Tonight had been different. Leo had been overstimulated by a day visit from Kaylin's mother, a glacial woman who'd looked at Sophie like she was a stain on expensive upholstery. And by 7 o'clock, he'd spiraled into a full meltdown. Not the gentle overwhelm from the gala, but a complete sensory overload. Screaming, crying, hitting himself in frustration. Sophie had handled it. She dimmed the lights, created a blanket fort, used every technique she knew. For 90 minutes, she'd sat with Leo in the darkness, humming softly, offering pressure and comfort until his small body had finally exhausted itself and he'd fallen asleep in her arms. She'd carried him to bed, tucked him in with his favorite weighted blanket and the smooth stone she'd given him at the gala, and then she'd escaped to the kitchen before her own composure shattered. Now she stood alone in the massive, sterile space, all marble and stainless steel, designed for caterers and staff, not actual family, and let herself shake. That was remarkable. Sophie spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Kaylin stood in the doorway, still in his work clothes, but with his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He looked exhausted and wrecked and absolutely devastating. "I didn't hear you," she managed. "I was watching." He moved into the kitchen, and the space that had felt vast suddenly contracted. From the hallway. I didn't want to interfere, but I couldn't. I needed to make sure he was okay. "He's fine. Sleeping." Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware that she'd changed into comfortable clothes, leggings and a soft t-shirt, and her hair was falling out of its ponytail. "Your mother's visit was hard for him. Too much stimulation, too many expectations." Something dark crossed Kaylin's face. She means well. She called him difficult. "I know." His voice was low, rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "I heard her." Sophie opened her mouth to say something diplomatic, something professional, but the words that came out were raw and honest. "He's not difficult. He's brilliant and sensitive, and perfect exactly as he is. She's the one with the problem." Kaylin stared at her, and the air between them shifted, became charged with something electric and dangerous. "You defend him like he's yours," he said softly. "He feels like mine." The confession slipped out before she could stop it, and Sophie felt her cheeks burn. "I'm sorry. That was inappropriate. I know he's your son. I didn't mean..." "Don't apologize." Kaylin crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 strides, and suddenly he was close. So close she could see the silver flecks in his gray eyes, could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Do you have any idea what it means to me? Watching you with him? Seeing someone finally understand him, protect him, fight for him." His voice was rough, barely controlled, and Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Vance." "Kaylin." His hand came up, and for a heart-stopping moment she thought he was going to touch her face. Instead, he braced it against the counter beside her hip, caging her in. "Say my name, Sophie." She should step away, Should remind him of her rule, of the professional boundaries they'd agreed to. Should do anything except stand here, drowning in the intensity of his gaze. "Kaylin," she whispered. Something in him broke. He kissed her like a man possessed, like he'd been holding himself back for 7 days and his control had finally shattered. His mouth claimed hers with a desperate hunger that stole her breath and ignited every nerve ending in her body. One hand slid into her hair, angling her head for deeper access, while the other gripped her hip, pulling her flush against him. Sophie gasped against his lips, and he took the opportunity to deepen the kiss, his tongue sweeping into her mouth with devastating skill. She'd been kissed before. Awkward teenage fumbling, a few disappointing dates in college. But this was different. This was claiming and surrender, demand and worship, all at once. Her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him closer even as her mind screamed at her to stop. This was wrong. This violated everything she'd said, everything she'd promised herself. But God, it felt like coming home. Kaylin's mouth moved from her lips to her jaw, trailing hot. Open-mouthed kisses down her neck. His hand slid under her shirt, fingers splaying across the bare skin of her waist, and Sophie arched into his touch with a small sound she didn't recognize as her own. "Sophie," he breathed against her throat, and the reverence in his voice made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "God, Sophie, I need—" His hand moved higher, and reality crashed back in like cold water. "Stop." The word came out strangled, desperate. Sophie pushed against his chest with trembling hands. "Kaylin, stop. We can't—" He froze immediately, his breath coming in harsh pants against her collarbone. For a long moment, neither of them moved, suspended in the wreckage of their control. Then Kaylin stepped back, and the loss of his heat was almost painful. Sophie pressed her hand against his chest, could feel his heart racing beneath her palm, as wild and erratic as her own. "The rule," she managed, her voice shaking. "Kaylin, we have to stop." He looked at her like she'd wounded him, his eyes dark with hunger and frustration, and something that looked dangerously like anguish. His hands came up to grip her wrists, gentle but unyielding, and she felt the tremor in his fingers. "Your rule," he said roughly. "Reserved for your husband." "Yes." The word was barely a whisper. "Why?" It was almost a plea. "Why, Sophie? Is it religion? Is it my mother?" The confession tore out of her, raw and painful. She gave everything to men who promised her the world and left her with nothing. She died drowning in debt and heartbreak, and I was there for all of it. I watched her lose herself piece by piece to men who never saw her as anything more than temporary. I won't do that. I won't give myself to someone unless they've promised me everything first. Unless they've stood up and claimed me in front of the world. Silence fell between them, broken only by their ragged breathing. Kaylin's thumb traced the racing pulse in her wrist. "I'm your employer. I know. This is complicated. I know. I should fire you, for both our sakes." Sophie's heart clenched, but she lifted her chin. "If that's what you need to do. But I won't." His voice dropped, became something dark and promise-filled. "Because Leo needs you, and I." He released her wrists and stepped back, raking a hand through his hair with barely controlled frustration. "I respect your rules, Sophie. I won't push you. But you need to know, this isn't over. It has to be. No." He held her gaze, and the intensity in his eyes made her knees weak. "It doesn't. Because rules can be followed, Sophie. Rules can be honored. And if the only way I can have you is to make you my wife." He let the words hang in the air between them, heavy with implication. Sophie's breath caught. "You don't mean that, don't I?" He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her with an expression that was equal parts hunger and determination. Get some rest, Sophie. Tomorrow, we're going to have a conversation about your sensory toy business. I have some ideas. Then he was gone, leaving Sophie alone in the kitchen, her lips still burning from his kiss, her body still humming with unfulfilled need, and her carefully constructed walls lying in ruins at her feet. She touched her fingers to her mouth, still feeling the imprint of his lips, still tasting him. The air crackled with unmet desire and the echo of her vow. She touched her fingers to her mouth, still feeling the imprint of his lips, still tasting him. The air crackled with unmet desire and the echo of her vow. And for the first time since her mother's death, Sophie wondered if maybe, just maybe, some rules were made to be rewritten. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, painting everything in shades of gold and promise. Sophie stood in the kitchen, that same kitchen where her world had tilted on its axis 12 hours ago, and tried to pretend her hands weren't shaking as she poured orange juice into Leo's favorite cup. She'd barely slept. Every time she'd closed her eyes, she'd felt Kalen's mouth on hers, his hands on her skin, the desperate hunger in his kiss that had matched the ache in her own chest. She'd replayed his words over and over until they'd worn grooves in her mind. If the only way I can have you is to make you my wife. He hadn't meant it. Couldn't have meant it. Men like Kalen Vance didn't marry their employees. They didn't fall for waitresses with second-hand clothes and impossible rules. They collected and discarded, moved on to the next acquisition, the next conquest. But the way he'd looked at her, morning. Sophie spun around, nearly dropping the juice container. Kalen stood in the doorway in charcoal gray pajama pants and a white t-shirt that clung to shoulders she now knew were solid muscle. His hair was mussed from sleep, his jaw shadowed with stubble. And he looked more human than she'd ever seen him. Less like an untouchable billionaire and more like a man who'd spent the night wrestling with the same demons that had kept her awake. Their eyes met, and the air between them ignited. "Good morning," Sophie managed, her voice embarrassingly breathless. She turned back to the counter, using the excuse of breakfast prep to avoid his gaze. "I was just making Leo's breakfast. He usually wakes up around 7:30, I know." Kalen moved into the kitchen, and Sophie felt every step like a physical touch. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell his soap, feel his warmth, and reached for the coffee maker. "You didn't sleep." It wasn't a question. "I slept fine," she lied. "Sophie." Her name was a gentle reprimand. "You have shadows under your eyes, and you've been staring at that juice container for 30 seconds without moving." She set down the container with more force than necessary. "I'm fine. We need to talk about last night." "There's nothing to talk about." She busied herself with pulling out the gluten-free bread Leo preferred, the almond butter, the sliced strawberries arranged just so. Anything to keep her hands occupied, to maintain some illusion of control. "It was a mistake. We both know it. Let's just—" "It wasn't a mistake." His voice was quiet but firm, and it stopped her mid-motion. "Look at me, Sophie." She didn't want to. Looking at him was dangerous. Looking at him made her want things she couldn't have. Made her forget all the reasons she'd built her walls in the first place. But she looked anyway. Kalen's expression was open in a way she'd never seen before. Vulnerable and honest and terrifyingly real. "I meant what I said. Every word. Kalen, let me finish." He set down his coffee mug and turned to face her fully. "I've spent the last 6 months trying to fix everything for Leo by throwing money at the problem. Therapists, specialists, nannies, all temporary solutions, all failures. Then you walked into my life and did what no one else could. You saw my son, Not his challenges, not his diagnosis, just him. Sophie's throat tightened. But that's not why I kissed you last night. He took a step closer, and she found herself unable to move, pinned by the intensity in his eyes. I kissed you because for the first time in years, someone saw me too. Not my bank account, not my company, not what I could give them. You looked at me like I was just a man, a flawed, desperate man trying to do right by his son. You are, she whispered. Something flickered in his expression. Relief, maybe, or hope. I won't apologize for wanting you. I won't pretend this is just about Leo anymore. But I will respect your rules, Sophie. I will honor it. His jaw clenched. Even if it kills me. Before Sophie could respond, before she could process the weight of his words or the sincerity blazing in his eyes, the patter of small feet announced Leo's arrival. The little boy appeared in the doorway, clutching his smooth stone in one hand and rubbing sleep from his eyes with the other. His gaze found Sophie immediately, and his face lit up with a smile that made her heart clench. "Good morning, sweetheart," Sophie said softly, the endearment slipping out naturally. She crouched down to his level. "Are you hungry?" Leo nodded and walked straight to her, pressing himself against her side in the silent request for a hug she'd learned to recognize. Sophie wrapped her arms around him, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo, and felt something settle in her chest. This was why she was here. This beautiful, brilliant boy who'd somehow claimed a piece of her heart in just 7 days. When she looked up, Kaylin was watching them with an expression that stole her breath. His eyes were soft, unguarded, filled with something that looked dangerously like tenderness. Not just for his son, for her too, for the picture they made together. For the first time, it didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a family. Kaylin couldn't breathe. He stood in his own kitchen, watching Sophie with Leo, and felt the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumble like sand. She was singing softly under her breath, something about sunshine and rainbows, while Leo ate his breakfast at the counter. Her hand rested on his son's back in an absent, affectionate gesture, and Leo leaned into her touch like a flower turning toward the sun. This was what he'd been missing. Not a nanny or a therapist or another specialist with letters after their name. This, someone who loved his son. Not because they were paid to, but because Leo was impossible not to love when you actually took the time to see him. But it was more than that, and Kaylin knew it with a certainty that terrified him. He was falling for her, had already fallen maybe. In that moment at the gala when she'd knelt beside his son and offered miracles in the form of a homemade fidget toy. He'd just been too arrogant, too controlled to recognize it. Sophie wasn't a problem to solve or a deal to close. She was necessary, as vital as air, as inevitable as gravity. And she'd drawn a line in the sand he couldn't cross, reserved for her husband. The words should have deterred him, should have made this simple, professional. Instead, they'd ignited something primal and possessive in his chest that refused to be ignored. If marriage was what it took to have her, then he'd marry her. It was that simple and that complicated. He'd built an empire from nothing. He'd turned a failing tech startup into a billion-dollar corporation through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. He could certainly convince one stubborn, principled woman that he was worthy of forever. The problem was, he'd never had to earn anything that mattered before. Money opened doors. Power commanded respect. But Sophie looked at his wealth like it was irrelevant, looked at him like she was waiting for something deeper, something real. He had no idea how to give her that. He'd spent 15 years building armor, creating distance, controlling every variable. Vulnerability was weakness, and weakness got you destroyed. But watching her with Leo, seeing the gentleness in her eyes, the genuine care in every movement, Kaylin realized that maybe, just maybe, vulnerability was the only currency that mattered. Kaylin? Sophie's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. She was looking at him with concern, Leo now occupied with his breakfast. Are you okay? No. He was the furthest thing from okay. He was in free fall, and there was no safety net. Fine, he said, the lie automatic. Then, because she deserved better than his walls, actually no, I'm not fine, but I will be. Understanding flickered in her dark eyes, along with something that might have been hope. We should talk, she said quietly, after Leo's morning routine, about everything. I'd like that. He forced himself to maintain distance, to not cross the kitchen and pull her into his arms, like every instinct screamed at him to do. I meant what I said earlier, Sophie, about your business. I want to help. Wariness crept into her expression. I don't need charity. It's not charity, it's an investment. He gentled his tone. Let me show you what I mean. After lunch, I have something to show you. Will you trust me? Sophie studied him for a long moment, and Kaylin felt like he was being weighed and measured, his worth calculated by some internal scale that had nothing to do with his net worth. Finally, she nodded. Okay, I'll trust you. The words settled in his chest like a promise, like a benediction. Kaylin Vance had conquered boardrooms and outmaneuvered competitors. He'd built an empire through calculated risks and ruthless efficiency. But winning Sophie Reed's trust felt like the greatest victory of his life. 2 days later, the three of them left Leo's occupational therapy session together. In the lobby, one of the other parents smiled politely at him. Your nanny is wonderful with him, she said, nodding towards Sophie, who was crouched beside Leo, helping him zip his jacket. Kaylin didn't even hesitate. She's not the nanny, he said mildly. She's Leo's companion and my partner on Reed & Co., the sensory company we're building. He watched Sophie's head snap up, eyes wide, a blush coloring her cheeks. Later that night, alone in his office, he realized how natural it had felt to say it. Not a correction, a truth his mouth had gotten to before his brain could. The car pulled up in front of a small storefront in Brooklyn, nestled between a vintage bookstore and a coffee shop with mismatched chairs spilling onto the sidewalk. Sophie stared out the window, confused. Where are we? She asked. Kaylin was already opening his door, moving around to her side with that controlled grace she'd come to recognize. He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. And Sophie tried to ignore the electric current that shot up her arm at the contact. You'll see, was all he said. The storefront had brown paper covering the windows, obscuring the interior. The door was new, painted a cheerful teal blue, with a silver handle that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Kaylin produced a key from his pocket and held it out to her. Sophie stared at the key like it might bite her. What is this? Open the door, Sophie. Her hand trembled as she took the key and fitted it into the lock. It turned smoothly, and the door swung open with a soft chime of bells. The interior took her breath away. Sunlight streamed through skylights she hadn't seen from outside, illuminating a space that was both workshop and boutique. To the left, pristine white shelving units displayed sensory toys in organized, artistic arrangements. Fidget cubes and weighted blankets, texture squares and calming jars, everything she'd ever dreamed of creating but had never had the resources to produce at scale. To the right, a fully equipped workshop space. industrial sewing machines, shelving units stocked with fabrics and materials, a large cutting table, ergonomic chairs, and storage organized with a precision that spoke of someone who'd actually understood what she needed. In the center, a sleek checkout counter with a modern point-of-sale system, and beyond that, a cozy seating area with soft lighting where parents and children could test products in comfort. On the back wall, in elegant silver letters, read in Comus, "Sensory Solutions," Sophie's vision blurred with tears. "I don't understand," she whispered. Kalen moved to stand beside her, his hands in his pockets, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked uncertain. "You mentioned your dream. That night in your apartment, I saw your prototypes. I saw the medical bills you were drowning in, the talent you couldn't afford to pursue." He gestured to the space around them. "This is yours, Sophie. The lease is paid for 2 years. The equipment, the initial inventory, the business licenses. It's all handled." "Kalen, I can't. This is too much. Let me finish." He pulled a leather portfolio from the counter and handed it to her. "This is a business plan. Conservative projections, marketing strategy, supplier contacts I've personally vetted. There's also a website. It went live this morning. And I've arranged meetings with 3 retailers who are interested in carrying your products." Sophie opened the portfolio with shaking hands, scanning pages of detailed research and financial projections that must have taken weeks to compile. Every aspect of her half-formed dream was here, crystallized into an actual, achievable plan. "The storefront can serve as both retail and production space," Kalen continued, his voice taking on the efficient tone she recognized from his business persona, but with an underlying current of something softer. "But you're not obligated to keep it. If you want to focus solely on wholesale or online sales, that's fine. This is your vision, Sophie. I just provided the foundation." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face now. "Why? Why would you do this?" The mask cracked, and she saw the raw honesty beneath. "Because when you talked about your sensory toys, your whole face lit up. Because you have a gift that could help thousands of children like Leo. Because you deserve to have someone believe in your dreams the way you've believed in my son." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to something intimate and achingly sincere. "Because seeing you happy makes me happy. And I know that sounds insane. We've known each other barely over a week. But it's true." "This isn't a business investment," Sophie said quietly. It's a grand gesture," he admitted. "It's me trying to show you, in the only way I know how, that I see you. Not as an employee, not as Leo's companion, but as a brilliant, talented woman who deserves to have her dreams realized." Sophie set down the portfolio and turned to face him fully. "You didn't just give me money. You could have written a check and walked away. But you actually listened. You understood what I wanted, what I needed. I tried to." He reached up, almost touching her face, then dropped his hand as if remembering her rule. "Sophie, I know I can't buy your affection. I know money doesn't mean love or commitment. But I wanted you to know that I believe in you. Completely. Whether you choose to be in my life or not, this business is yours. No strings attached." It was the "no strings attached" that broke her. Because there were strings. Invisible, unbreakable threads connecting her heart to his, wound around them both in the week they'd lived under the same roof. She'd tried to maintain distance, tried to keep her walls intact. But this man, this impossible, complicated, generous man, kept finding ways through her defenses. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Say you'll take it. Say you'll let me be part of watching your dream come true." His eyes searched hers, vulnerable and hopeful. Say you'll give me a chance to prove I'm not just a billionaire with a checkbook. I'm a man who's falling for you, Sophie Reed. And I don't care if it's too soon or too complicated or violates every professional boundary. It's the truth. Sophie's breath caught. Kaylin, you don't have to say anything back. I know your rule. I'll respect it. His jaw clenched with the visible effort of restraint. But I needed you to know. I needed you to understand that this, he gestured to the shop around them, isn't about obligation or leverage. It's about showing you what you mean to me in the only language I'm fluent in. Actions, Sophie realized, not words. He'd listened to her half-formed dream and built it into reality. He'd seen her struggling and created a path forward. He'd given her agency and independence while simultaneously declaring his feelings. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. It was everything she'd never known she wanted. Thank you, she managed through her tears. This is Kaylin. This is the most incredible thing anyone has ever done for me. The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise, brilliant and transformative and utterly devastating. You haven't seen everything yet. He guided her toward the back of the shop, where a door led to a small office. Inside, on the desk, sat a framed photograph of Leo, smiling at the camera with one of her fidget toys in his hands. Beside it, a card in Kaylin's bold handwriting. To Sophie, you gave my son peace. You gave me hope. This is just the beginning. K. Sophie picked up the card with trembling hands and felt something inside her chest crack wide open. She'd spent her entire adult life building walls, protecting herself from the kind of heartbreak that had destroyed her mother. She'd created her rule as armor, as insurance, as a guarantee that no man would have the power to shatter her the way she'd watched her mother be shattered. But standing in this beautiful space, this tangible proof that someone had listened to her, valued her, believed in her, Sophie realized that walls couldn't protect her from Kaylin Vance, because he wasn't asking for her body. He was asking for something far more dangerous. He was asking for her heart. And God help her, she wanted to give it to him. Kaylin watched emotions play across Sophie's face, shock, joy, wonder, and something that looked like fear, and felt his own heart hammer against his ribs. He'd never been nervous about a business deal. He'd negotiated billion-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat, stared down hostile boards with cold precision. But watching Sophie process his gesture, waiting for her reaction, was the most terrifying experience of his life. Because it mattered. She mattered. If she rejected this, rejected him, he didn't know how he'd survive it. Say something, he finally said, unable to bear the silence any longer. Sophie set down the card and turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't know how to accept this. I don't know how to be the kind of person who deserves this. You just are. He closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. You don't have to do anything or be anything different. You're already exactly who I want. I'm a waitress with a high school diploma and a mountain of debt. You're a brilliant designer who created something beautiful and functional that helps children. You're a woman with integrity who stands by her principles even when it's hard. You're the only person who's ever made my son smile. His voice roughened. You're the only woman who's ever made me want to be better than I am. Kaylin, I'm not asking for anything, he said quickly, before she could retreat behind her walls again. I'm not proposing or demanding you change your rule, or even expecting you to feel the same way. I just needed you to know. You've changed everything, Sophie. In less than 2 weeks, you've turned my fortress into a home and reminded me what it feels like to want something money can't buy. Sophie's hand came up to rest against his chest, right over his racing heart. The touch was feather light, but sent shockwaves through his entire system. "You scare me," she whispered. "Why?" "Because you make me want things. Want you. Want a future I never let myself imagine." Her eyes met his, dark and honest and devastating. "I'm terrified of becoming my mother, of giving everything to someone who will leave." Kaylin covered her hand with his own, pressing it more firmly against his chest. "I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not asking you to give me everything, not yet. I'm asking you to let me prove I'm worthy of it. However long that takes." "What if I can't? What if I'm too damaged, too guarded?" "Then I'll wait." The words came from somewhere deep and true, a certainty he felt in his bones. "I'll wait as long as it takes for you to trust that I'm not like the men who hurt your mother, that I see you as more than temporary, that when I look at you, I see forever." Sophie made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You're making it very hard to maintain professional boundaries." "Good." He allowed himself a small smile. "That's the idea." For a moment, they stood there in the small office of her new shop, hands clasped, hearts racing, balanced on the knife's edge between what was and what could be. Then Sophie rose on her toes and pressed a soft, sweet kiss to his cheek. Nowhere near his mouth, but devastatingly intimate all the same. "Thank you," she whispered against his skin, "for seeing me, for believing in me, for this." When she pulled back, Kaylin had to clench his fists to keep from dragging her against him and kissing her properly. The restraint cost him everything, but he held firm. Her rule. He would honor it, even if it killed him. "The grand opening is scheduled for 2 weeks from today," he said, forcing his voice back to something approaching normal. "I've hired a publicist to handle the media, but it's your call whether you want to do that. This is your business, Sophie. I'm just support staff." She laughed, the sound bright and genuine. "You're impossible. I'm determined." He stepped back, putting necessary distance between them before his control snapped entirely. "Come on, let's get back to Leo. He has occupational therapy in an hour, and you know how he gets if we're late." As they walked back through the shop, her dream made real, Kaylin felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Hope. For the first time since Leo's mother had walked out with a litany of cruel words about their defective son, Kaylin allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't just him and Leo against the world. A future that included Sophie, a real family, something resembling happiness. He'd built this for her. He'd build 1,000 more things if it meant keeping that light in her eyes. And someday, when she was ready, when she trusted him enough, he'd build a life with her, no matter how long it took. 2 weeks later, Sophie stood in her shop surrounded by congratulatory flower arrangements and the gentle hum of success, and felt her world begin to crumble. The grand opening had been perfect, more than perfect. The local press had covered it, parents had come in droves, and she'd already received wholesale inquiries from 3 major retailers. Her dream was coming true in real time, and it was overwhelming and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Kaylin had been there all day, a steady presence in the background. He'd stayed out of the spotlight, let her shine, but she'd felt his support like a physical thing. Every time she'd caught his eye across the crowded shop, he'd smiled at her with such pride and warmth that her chest had ached. Leo had been there too, happily playing with the sensory toys in the testing area, occasionally bringing her new customers like a tiny, perfect ambassador. It had felt like family. That should have been her first warning. The second warning came when a sleek black town car pulled up outside and a woman in a Chanel suit stepped out with the predatory grace of old money and colder blood. Victoria Vance, Kaylin's mother. Sophie had met her exactly twice, and both encounters had left her feeling like she'd been appraised and found wanting. The woman had a talent for insults disguised as compliments, for making Sophie feel like hired help even when she was supposedly being welcomed. Now Victoria swept into the shop like a winter storm, all expensive perfume and calculated smiles. "Sophie, darling." She air-kissed both of Sophie's cheeks, her lips not quite making contact. What a charming little shop. How quaint. Sophie's stomach clenched, but she forced a smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Vance. I'm so glad you could make it." "Oh, I wouldn't miss it." Victoria's gaze swept the shop with barely concealed condescension. "Kalen has been absolutely obsessed with this project. I haven't seen him this focused on anything outside of work in years." Something in her tone set off alarm bells, but Sophie pushed the feeling aside. "He's been very supportive." "Supportive?" Victoria's smile sharpened. "Yes, that's one word for it. Though I suppose invested might be more accurate." She plucked a fidget cube from a display, turning it over in her manicured hands. "These are the toys you make for Leo." "Some of them, yes. Though the product line has expanded." "How wonderful that you found your niche." Victoria set down the cube with exaggerated care. Kalen always has had a talent for identifying specialized resources. First, the occupational therapist, then the behavioral specialist, now you. He's building quite the team around Leo. The words landed like small cuts, precise and poisonous. "I'm not," Sophie started, but Victoria continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I'm so relieved, actually," Victoria went on. "Having someone with your particular expertise living in the penthouse has been such a blessing. Leo needs someone who understands his challenges, and you're clearly very qualified for that role." Her smile sharpened. "Women like you are invaluable to families like ours." "Role." The word echoed in Sophie's mind, ugly and diminishing. "Mrs. Vance, please call me Victoria. We're practically family now." The smile didn't reach her eyes. "Or rather, you're part of Leo's support system, which is almost the same thing." Sophie's throat tightened, but she maintained her composure. This was Kalen's mother. She couldn't afford to make a scene, to burn bridges that might hurt him or Leo. "I should get back to the guests," she managed. Of course. Don't let me keep you." Victoria patted her arm with false warmth. "I just wanted to tell you how grateful we all are. It's such a relief that Kalen found someone so specialized to handle Leo. The perfect person for the job." "The perfect person for the job?" The words followed Sophie as she moved through the rest of the evening, serving customers and accepting congratulations with a smile that felt more like a mask with each passing minute. She kept looking for Kalen, needing him to appear and somehow make this better. Needing him to say something, anything, that would prove Victoria wrong. But when he finally emerged from the back office where he'd been taking a business call, his mother was already at his side, whispering something in his ear with that same calculated smile. Sophie watched as Kalen's expression shifted, from warm to carefully neutral, from open to closed. The walls she'd watched him slowly dismantle over the past 2 weeks snapped back into place with terrifying efficiency. When his eyes found hers across the room, there was distance in them, hesitation. And Sophie felt her heart crack. He didn't correct his mother, didn't stride across the room and introduce Sophie as someone important, someone who mattered beyond her utility with his son. He simply stood there, frozen in whatever toxic spell Victoria had cast, looking at Sophie like she was an employee whose presence required acknowledgement, but not warmth. In that moment, Sophie understood with brutal clarity what she'd been trying to deny for weeks. In his world, she would always be the help, the nanny with a fancy title. The waitress he'd elevated out of pity and necessity. Not his equal, not his partner. Certainly not someone he'd ever introduce as the woman he loved. The shop felt too small suddenly, too hot, too full of people congratulating her on a success that was built on his money and would forever be tainted by his control. Sophie made it through the rest of the evening on autopilot, her smile fixed, her responses automatic. When the last guest finally left and she was alone with Kaylin and Leo, she couldn't bear to look at him. "Sophie." His voice was careful, tentative. "That was incredible. You were incredible." She busied herself with straightening displays that didn't need straightening. "Thank you. My mother was very complimentary." Sophie cut him off, her voice brittle. "She's thrilled you found someone so specialized to handle Leo." Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. "Sophie, look at me." She couldn't. If she looked at him, she'd shatter. "I need to go home," she said quietly. "To my apartment. I need some space." "Don't do this." Now there was desperation in his voice. "Don't let her poison what we have." "What do we have?" Sophie finally turned to face him, and she saw him flinch at whatever he saw in her eyes. "I'm your employee, Kaylin. The person you hired to manage your son's needs. Your mother made that very clear. That's not what you are. Then what am I?" The question came out sharper than intended. "Because from where I'm standing, I'm the girl you pulled out of poverty to serve a purpose. And yes, you dressed it up in a beautiful shop and supportive words, but at the end of the day, I'm still the help, still someone you acquired to solve a problem. That's not fair, isn't it?" Sophie's voice cracked. "You didn't defend me. Your mother stood in my shop, the shop you built for me, which somehow makes it even worse, and made it clear that I'll never be anything more than hired help in your world. And you said nothing." Kaylin's face had gone pale, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. "I froze. It was wrong, and I'm sorry. I don't need your apologies." Sophie grabbed her coat, her hands shaking. "I need to think. I need to figure out if I can keep doing this." "Don't." He reached for her, then stopped, his hand falling to his side. "Please don't go. Let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about." She looked at him, really looked at him, and felt tears burn behind her eyes. "You hired me to help your son feel seen, but you've never made me feel anything but invisible." The words landed like a physical blow. Kaylin actually stumbled back, his face crumpling with something that looked like anguish. "Sophie." But she was already moving toward the door, grabbing her purse, fleeing before the tears could fall. "I'll be back for my things tomorrow," she managed. "Tell Leo, tell him I'm sorry." She walked out into the cold November night, leaving Kaylin standing alone in her shop, his shop really. Since his money had built it, his connections had stocked it, his privilege had made it possible. She'd been a fool to think she could be anything more than another acquisition, another problem solved with money and strategic planning. Sophie made it 3 blocks before the tears came, hot and angry and grief-stricken. She'd broken her own rule. Not physically, she'd held firm on that. But in every way that mattered, she'd given Kaylin her heart. And he'd stood silent while his mother made it clear that her heart was worthless in his world. Back in her tiny apartment, Sophie dropped her purse on the table and stared at the neat stack of Reed & Kober business cards waiting beside her sewing machine. For a wild second, she wanted to sweep them all into the trash, to pretend the last few weeks had been a fever dream. Instead, she picked one up and turned it between her fingers until the edges dug into her skin. Reed & Kober's Sensory Solutions, her name underneath, his money behind it. She set the card down very carefully, like it was something that might explode. Then opened the drawer where she kept her oldest prototypes. the fraying fidget cord she'd made for her brother, the first flannel-wrapped stone. Those had been born from necessity, from love, from seeing someone who needed help and doing the best she could with what she had. Tears blurred her vision. She shut the drawer. She could survive without the penthouse, without the shop if she had to. She'd done it before. What she didn't know how to survive was the way he'd looked right through her when it mattered most. Kaylin stood in the empty shop, surrounded by Sophie's dreams and his own devastating failure, and felt his entire world collapse. She was right. About all of it. He'd frozen when his mother had started her poisonous performance. Years of conditioning, of being the dutiful son, of maintaining appearances, of keeping family peace at all costs, had kicked in automatically. He'd reverted to the cold, controlled man he'd been before Sophie, letting his mother's words go unchallenged, because confronting her would have meant making a scene, would have meant publicly claiming Sophie as something more than an employee, as something irreplaceable and precious and forever. And he'd been too much of a coward to do it. The irony was savage. He'd told Sophie he was falling for her. He'd built her a business to prove his feelings were real. He'd promised to wait as long as it took for her to trust him. But when the moment came, when she'd needed him to defend her, to stand up and declare her importance in his life, he'd failed. He'd let his mother reduce Sophie to the help, and his silence had confirmed it. Kaylin sank into one of the chairs in the testing area, his head in his hands, and tried to remember how to breathe. Leo. God, Leo was going to be devastated. His son had bonded with Sophie in a way Kaylin had never seen him bond with anyone. She'd become as essential to Leo's well-being as she'd become to Kaylin's own heart. And Kaylin had just lost her. His phone sat heavy in his pocket. He could call her, beg, grovel, promise to be better. But words were cheap. He'd learned that from his ex-wife, who'd made vows at an altar and broken them the moment their son's autism diagnosis became inconvenient for her social climbing. Sophie deserved more than words. She deserved actions. Proof. She deserved someone who would stand up to the world and claim her without hesitation. Kaylin pulled out his phone, but instead of calling Sophie, he dialed his mother. She answered on the first ring, her voice honey-sweet. Darling, what a lovely event. Sophie's little shop is absolutely precious. That was unforgivable. His voice was cold, harder than he'd ever used with her before. What you said to her, how you made her feel. Unforgivable. Silence. Then, carefully. I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Yes, you do. You went into her shop and systematically made her feel like hired help, like she's replaceable. Like she means nothing. His hand clenched around the phone. She means everything, Mother. Everything. And you tried to destroy that because you can't stand to see me happy with someone you can't control. Kaylin, you're being dramatic. I'm done. The words felt like freedom, like finally breaking chains he hadn't realized were choking him. I'm done prioritizing your approval over my own life. I'm done letting you dictate who's worthy and who isn't. Sophie Reed is the best thing that's ever happened to me and Leo. And if you can't respect that, then you're not welcome in our lives. You can't be serious. I'm your mother. Then act like it. Act like you care about my happiness instead of your social standing. Apologize to Sophie, genuinely, or we're done. He ended the call before she could respond, his heart pounding, his hands shaking. It was too late. The damage was done. But at least he'd finally said what he should have said the moment his mother had started her toxic performance. At least he'd finally chosen Sophie. Now he just had to figure out how to prove it to her. Kaylin looked down at his phone, pulling up the contact for his attorney, and began making plans. Grand gestures and pretty shops weren't enough. Sophie needed something bigger. Something that showed her she wasn't just an employee or a convenient solution. She needed a proposal that proved she was his equal, his partner, his future. And Kalen Vance was very, very good at getting what he needed. 7 days. Sophie had been gone for 7 days, and Kalen felt every hour like a knife wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. She'd returned to the penthouse exactly once, while he was at the office, deliberately avoiding him, to collect her belongings. She'd left a formal letter of resignation on the kitchen counter, professionally worded and devastatingly final. She'd also left a note for Leo, written in her gentle script, explaining that she had to go, but that he was the most wonderful boy she'd ever known. Leo had stopped speaking again. Not the comfortable, selective mutism that was part of his natural communication style, but the traumatized silence that came from loss. He carried the smooth stone Sophie had given him everywhere, clutched it while he slept. And sometimes Kalen caught him staring at the door like he was waiting for her to come home. Kalen understood the feeling. He was doing the same thing. He'd tried calling. She'd blocked his number. He'd tried emailing. She'd sent one response: "Please respect my decision and give me space." He'd tried sending flowers to her apartment. She'd returned them with a note that said simply, "I don't want your money." I never did. His mother had called 3 times. He'd ignored every call. She'd sent a letter, an actual paper letter, probably because he'd blocked her number too, attempting to justify her behavior and suggesting that Sophie was oversensitive and clearly not suited to their world. Kalen had thrown the letter in the fireplace and watched it burn. He'd failed Sophie, failed Leo, failed himself. And now he was standing outside Sophie's apartment building at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, his suit jacket abandoned, his tie loosened, looking like a man who'd been to hell and hadn't quite made it back. He'd spent the past week putting pieces in place, making calls, restructuring his life, preparing for this moment. But now that he was here, terror threatened to paralyze him. What if she wouldn't let him in? What if his words weren't enough? What if he destroyed the best thing in his life through silence and cowardice, and he'd never get the chance to make it right? Kalen forced himself to move, to climb the stairs to her 3rd-floor walk-up, to stand in front of her door with his heart in his throat. He knocked. Silence. He knocked again. "Go away, Kalen." Her voice came through the door, muffled but unmistakable. "I meant what I said. I need space." "I know, and I'm sorry. But please, 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. 5 minutes. And if you still want me to leave, I will. I swear." More silence. Then, finally, the sound of locks turning. The door opened, and Kalen forgot how to breathe. Sophie looked exhausted. She wore an old college sweatshirt and leggings, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, her eyes rimmed with shadows that suggested she'd been sleeping as poorly as he had. No makeup, no armor, just raw, honest exhaustion. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. 5 minutes, she said, her voice carefully neutral. She didn't invite him in, just stood in the doorway like a sentinel guarding her heart. Kalen looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something inside him break open. "I failed you," he said simply. "When you needed me most, I froze. I let years of toxic conditioning and family obligation override what I knew was right. I stood there and let my mother make you feel invisible when you're the most visible. Vital person in my world." Sophie's expression didn't change, but he saw her throat work as she swallowed. "I've spent my entire adult life building walls," Kalen continued, his voice rough with emotion. "After Leo's mother left, I convinced myself that control was safety, that if I managed every variable, anticipated every problem, I could protect my son from being hurt again. But you can't control love. You can't strategize vulnerability, and you can't buy what actually matters. I know that, Sophie said quietly. That's why I left. I know you do. You've always known it. That's what makes you so rare. He took a breath, steadying himself. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to tell you that I've spent the last week dismantling everything I thought I needed to be. Her eyes flickered with something. Surprise, maybe. Or cautious interest. I fired my mother from the Vance Foundation board, Kaylin said. Effective immediately. I told her that until she apologizes to you, genuinely, sincerely, she's not welcome in my home or Leo's life. I've also restructured my company leadership so I can work from home 3 days a week. Leo needs me present, not just providing. You taught me that. Sophie's hand tightened on the doorframe, but she didn't speak. I met with a therapist, he continued. Someone who specializes in family trauma and control issues. Because you were right. I do try to solve everything with money and power. It's the only language I've ever been fluent in. But I want to learn a new language. The language of showing up, of being vulnerable, of choosing people over pride. Kaylin, please, let me finish. He could feel his control cracking. Could feel every defense he'd ever built crumbling like sand. You asked me what you were to me, and I didn't answer. I stood there like a coward and let you walk away, believing you were just an employee, just hired help. He took a step closer, close enough to see the tears gathering in her eyes. You want to know what you are? His voice broke. You're the reason I wake up in the morning wanting to be better than I was the day before. You're the person who made my son smile again. You're the woman who looked at my fortress and saw a prison, who looked at my armor and saw loneliness. You're my conscience and my comfort and my catastrophe, in the best possible way. A tear slipped down Sophie's cheek. You're not my employee? Kaylin said, his own voice thick with unshed tears. You're not someone I hired or acquired or added to my portfolio. You're the woman I love, the woman I want to build a life with, the woman I want to marry. Sophie's breath caught audibly. I know I don't deserve you, he continued. And then, before he could second-guess himself, before pride could stop him, Kaylin dropped to his knees on her apartment hallway. I know I've given you every reason not to trust me. I know I hurt you when you needed me to protect you. But I'm asking you, begging you, to give me another chance. He looked up at her, and he didn't care that his eyes were wet. Didn't care that he was on his knees in a shabby hallway. Didn't care about anything except making her understand. Not as your employer, not as some charitable benefactor, as a man who's so desperately in love with you that he can't function. As a man who wants to spend the rest of his life proving he's worthy of you. Sophie was crying openly now, her hand pressed to her mouth. I don't want a nanny for Leo, Kaylin said. I want a mother, a partner, someone who'll call me on my bullshit and make me laugh and teach me how to be the man Leo deserves as a father. He reached into his pocket with a trembling hand and pulled out a small velvet box. I bought this 2 weeks ago, the day after I gave you the shop. I've been carrying it ever since, waiting for the right moment to ask. And then I destroyed everything, and I thought I'd never get the chance. He opened the box, revealing a ring that caught the hallway light and fractured it into rainbows. It wasn't the biggest diamond in the world. Kaylin had deliberately avoided that trap. Instead, it was an elegant sapphire surrounded by smaller diamonds, set in a delicate platinum band. Simple, meaningful, beautiful without being ostentatious. This sapphire is the color of Leo's eyes, he said quietly, and the same color as the sky the day you first smiled at him. I had it custom made because I wanted you to know. This isn't about money or grand gestures. It's about family, about forever, about choosing you every single day for the rest of my life. Sophie was shaking now, tears streaming down her face. Sophie Reed, will you marry me? The words came out raw and honest and terrified. Not because of Leo, though he loves you desperately. Not because of your business or because I'm trying to control you or keep you close. But because you're the only woman I've ever loved. The only woman I'll ever want. And I promise you, I swear to you on everything I am, that I will spend every day proving you're not invisible. You're everything. You're my entire world. The silence stretched between them, and Kalen felt his heart hammering so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. Sophie stared down at him, at this powerful man on his knees in her hallway, and saw everything she'd been afraid to hope for. Vulnerability, honesty, change, love. Get up, she whispered. Kalen's face fell, devastation crashing over his features. He started to close the ring box, started to rise. No. Sophie's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. Get up so I can kiss you properly. His head snapped up, hope blazing in his eyes. Sophie. Yes. She was laughing through her tears now, pulling him to his feet. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to all of it. But first, you need to understand something. She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. I didn't leave because of your money, she said firmly. I left because I needed to know you'd choose me even when it was hard, even when it meant standing up to your family and your world and everything you thought you needed to be. I needed to know I wasn't just another acquisition. You're not. I know that now. She stroked her thumb across his cheekbone, wiping away the tear that had escaped. You came here without your armor. You got on your knees. You chose me over pride and control and everything that's kept you safe. Her voice softened. You let me see you break. That's how I know this is real. Kalen pulled her against him, burying his face in her neck, and Sophie felt his whole body shudder with relief and emotion. I love you, he said against her skin. God, Sophie, I love you so much it terrifies me. I love you too. The words felt like freedom, like finally letting go of the fear that had controlled her for so long. I think I loved you from that first moment in the kitchen when you kissed me, and then respected my rule even though it was killing you. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his eyes still wet but blazing with joy. Does that mean? Not yet. Sophie smiled. I meant what I said. Reserved for my husband, but... She glanced at the ring box still clutched in his hand. I think we should probably make that happen soon, don't you? The smile that broke across Kalen's face was incandescent. How soon? His voice was rough with barely restrained desire. Very soon. She laughed at the hunger in his eyes. But first, you need to put that ring on my finger. Properly this time. And then you need to come inside and tell me exactly how you're going to make this work. Because I'm still terrified, Kalen. I'm still afraid of losing myself, of becoming invisible again. Never. He pulled the ring from its box with trembling hands and took her left hand in his. You will never be invisible. Not in my life. Not in my world. I'll spend every single day making sure you know exactly how seen you are. He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, like it had been waiting for her all along. It's beautiful, Sophie whispered, watching the sapphire catch the light. You're beautiful. Kalen pulled her close again, resting his forehead against hers. And you're mine. Finally, completely mine. Not yet, she reminded him with a smile. Soon. Then. his eyes darkened with promise. Very, very soon. Sophie kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise. Not the desperate, heated kiss from the kitchen, but something deeper, something that tasted like forever. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Sophie pulled him into her apartment and closed the door on the world outside. They had plans to make, a wedding to arrange, a future to build. But for now, for this moment, it was enough to sit on her second-hand couch with his arms around her and her head on his shoulder, talking about everything and nothing until the night grew late and the city went quiet around them. And when Kaylin finally left, after a dozen more kisses and countless promises, Sophie stood in her apartment wearing his ring and feeling, for the first time in her life, completely and perfectly seen. 3 weeks later, Sophie stood in a small room off the main sanctuary of a Brooklyn church, staring at her reflection in a full-length mirror, and tried to convince herself this was real. The dress was simple, ivory silk that draped elegantly without being fussy, with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing skirt that whispered when she moved. No train, no veil, no elaborate production. Just a beautiful dress that made her feel like herself, only more so. In her hair, instead of a traditional veil, she wore a small comb adorned with sapphires that matched her engagement ring. A gift from Kaylin, presented last night with a tenderness that had made her cry. "You look like a princess," a small voice said from the doorway. Sophie turned to find Leo standing there in his tiny suit, looking so handsome and nervous that her heart clenched. He was holding the ring box in his small hands, his designated role as ring bearer, something he'd taken very seriously. "Do I?" She crouched down to his level, careful not to wrinkle her dress. "I was worried I looked too plain." Leo shook his head solemnly and reached out to touch one of the sapphires in her hair. Pretty, like stars. Sophie felt tears prick her eyes. Leo had been speaking more since she'd said yes to Kaylin. Still selectively, still in his own time, but with increasing confidence. Having her back in the penthouse, knowing she wasn't leaving, had given him the security he needed to open up. "Thank you, sweetheart." She pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Are you ready to walk me down the aisle?" It had been Sophie's idea, not a traditional escort, but Leo holding her hand as they walked together toward his father, a symbol of the family they were becoming, all three of them choosing each other. Leo nodded and slipped his small hand into hers. The ceremony was intimate. Just 40 guests in a historic Brooklyn church with exposed brick and afternoon light streaming through tall windows. Kaylin had wanted to offer her a massive society wedding, but Sophie had firmly declined. This was about them, not spectacle, not performance. Their guests were the people who mattered, a few close friends, Kaylin's business partner Marcus and his family, some of the therapists and specialists who'd become part of Leo's support system, and surprisingly, Sophie's former co-workers from the catering company who'd shown up with tears and genuine joy. Victoria Vance was notably absent. She'd sent a stiff letter of apology 3 days after Kaylin's ultimatum, clearly written by a lawyer devoid of genuine emotion. Sophie had read it, acknowledged it, and made it clear that Victoria would need to do much better before she'd be welcome in their lives. Kaylin had supported her decision without hesitation. The music changed, not the traditional wedding march, but a soft acoustic guitar playing a melody Kaylin had commissioned specifically for this day. "Ready?" Sophie whispered to Leo. He squeezed her hand and nodded. The doors opened, and Sophie's breath caught. Kaylin stood at the altar in a charcoal gray suit, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes locked on her with such intensity that she felt it like a physical touch. He looked terrified and joyful and completely undone. Sophie started walking, Leo's small hand in hers, and the world narrowed to this moment. This choice, this man waiting for her at the end of an aisle that felt both infinitely long and not nearly long enough. When they reached the altar, Leo carefully transferred Sophie's hand to Kaylin's, then took his position beside his father, clutching the ring box like it held the secrets of the universe. Kaylin's hand was warm, solid, trembling slightly as his fingers closed around hers. "Hi," Sophie whispered. "Hi." His voice was rough, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You're stunning. You're not so bad yourself." The officiant, a kind-faced woman who'd counseled them through their pre-marriage sessions, smiled warmly. "We're gathered here today to witness the union of Kaylin and Sophie, who have chosen to build a life together not out of convention or convenience, but out of genuine love and commitment." The ceremony was short, focused on the vows they'd written themselves. When it was Kaylin's turn, he pulled out a folded piece of paper with hands that shook slightly. "Sophie," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the small sanctuary. "3 months ago, you walked into my life and showed me what I'd been missing. Not just a companion for Leo, though you've been that and so much more. You showed me that control isn't strength, vulnerability is. That walls don't protect, they isolate. That love isn't something you acquire or manage, it's something you surrender to." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "I promise to choose you every single day, in the easy moments and the hard ones. When I'm tempted to retreat behind my armor, I promise to stay open. When I'm scared, I promise to trust you with that fear. I promise to never make you feel invisible, to always defend you, to build a life where you feel seen and cherished and celebrated." His voice dropped, became more intimate. "I promise to be worthy of your trust, to honor your strength, to love you not as something I possess, but as someone I partner with. You saved my son, but you saved me too. And I will spend every day of our marriage making sure you know how much that means." Sophie was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe away the tears. When it was her turn, she didn't need notes. The words came straight from her heart. "Kaylin, you terrified me." A soft laugh rippled through the guests. "You walked into my tiny apartment and offered me everything I thought I wanted, and all I could think was that it was too good to be true. That someone like you couldn't possibly see someone like me." She squeezed his hands. "But you did see me. You saw my dreams and built them a foundation. You saw my fears and gave me time to trust. You saw my rule and respected it, even when it cost you everything." Her voice strengthened. "I promise to be your partner, not your subordinate. To call you out when you're wrong and celebrate you when you're right. I promise to love Leo as my own, to build a home that's warm instead of just beautiful, to create a family based on connection instead of control." She smiled through her tears. "I promise to trust you with my heart, to believe that when you say forever, you mean it, to let myself be seen, even when it's scary. You gave me my voice back, Kaylin. You made me believe I was worth fighting for. And I promise to fight for us every single day." The officiant smiled. "The rings, please." Leo stepped forward, carefully opening the box to reveal 2 simple platinum bands. Kaylin took Sophie's ring and slid it onto her finger, his eyes locked on hers. "With this ring, I thee wed." Sophie took his ring, her hand steadier now, and placed it on his finger. "With this ring, I thee wed." "By the power vested in me," the officiant said warmly, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Kaylin, you may kiss your bride." Kaylin's hands came up to frame Sophie's face, his touch impossibly gentle. "Finally," he whispered against her lips. Then he kissed her, tender and claiming, reverent and possessive, a promise and a beginning all at once. The small crowd erupted in applause and cheers, but Sophie barely heard them. She was drowning in the feel of his mouth on hers, the solid warmth of his body, the certainty that this was right. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and smiling, Leo tugged on Sophie's dress. "My turn," he said firmly. Sophie laughed and crouched down, and Leo threw his arms around her neck in a fierce hug that made her heart overflow. "Love you," he whispered against her ear, words he'd never said to anyone except his father. "I love you too, sweetheart," Sophie managed past the lump in her throat. So much." Kalen pulled them both into his arms, and for a moment, the three of them stood there in the church, a family finally and completely whole. The reception was held at a charming restaurant in Brooklyn, all exposed brick and string lights and food that actually tasted good instead of just looking impressive. Dancing and laughter and toasts that ranged from heartfelt to hilarious. But as the evening wore on, Sophie became increasingly aware of Kalen's eyes on her, the heat in his gaze, the barely restrained hunger that he'd been holding back for months. Tonight, finally, he wouldn't have to. They left the reception early, scandalously early by society standards, claiming exhaustion but fooling no one. Leo was spending the night with Marcus and his family, excited about a sleepover with other children. Kalen had arranged for them to stay at a luxury hotel in Manhattan, not the penthouse, which held too many memories of restraint. This would be neutral ground, new memories. The car ride was silent, charged with anticipation. Kalen's hand rested on her thigh, his thumb tracing small circles through the silk of her dress that made Sophie's breath catch. "Nervous?" he murmured. "Terrified," she admitted, also excited. "Also worried I waited so long that now I've built it up too much in my head and—" He silenced her with a kiss, deep and thorough and full of promise. When he pulled back, his eyes were dark. "Stop thinking," he said softly. "Trust me. Trust us." The hotel suite was beautiful. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, a massive bed dressed in white linens, champagne chilling in an ice bucket. But Sophie barely registered any of it. All she could see was Kalen, illuminated by city lights, looking at her like she was the only thing that mattered in the entire world. "Come here," he said quietly. Sophie crossed to him, and he immediately pulled her into his arms, his hands splaying across her back. "I've dreamed about this," he murmured against her hair. "Every night since that kiss in the kitchen, I've imagined what it would be like to have you without barriers, without rules, just us. I dreamed about it too." Sophie tilted her head back to look at him. "But I was also scared that I wouldn't be enough, that I wouldn't know how. Sophie?" He cupped her face, his touch achingly tender. "You're everything, and we have the rest of our lives to figure out the how. Tonight isn't about performance or expectation. It's about finally being able to show you, physically, what I've been feeling for months." He kissed her then, slow and deep and devastating. His hands moved to the zipper of her dress, and he paused, his eyes asking permission. Sophie nodded, her breath catching. The dress pooled at her feet, leaving her in simple ivory lingerie. Not the elaborate bridal sets she'd seen in shops, but something that made her feel beautiful and like herself. Kalen's breath caught. "God, Sophie, you're perfect." His hands traced her curves with a reverence that made her feel like art, like something precious and rare. He kissed her shoulder, her collarbone, the hollow of her throat, each touch worshipful and patient. Sophie's fingers fumbled with the buttons of his shirt, and he helped her, shrugging out of it to reveal the muscled chest she'd only glimpsed before. She pressed her palm against his heart, feeling it race beneath her touch. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you more than I have words for." He guided her toward the bed, and they fell together onto the soft linens. What followed was both awkward and perfect. Fumbling discoveries and breathless laughter, Sophie's nervousness gradually melting under Kaylin's patient, thorough attention. He took his time learning her body, finding what made her gasp and arch and cling to him. He whispered praise and promises against her skin, telling her how beautiful she was, how much he wanted her, how long he'd waited for this. And when they finally came together, when Sophie felt the brief pain followed by overwhelming fullness and connection, she looked into Kaylin's eyes and saw her entire future reflected there. "Okay?" he breathed, holding himself absolutely still despite the tension in every line of his body. "More than okay." She pulled him down for a kiss. "Perfect." He moved then, slow and careful, building a rhythm that Sophie's body instinctively matched. The awkwardness faded, replaced by something primal and beautiful and intensely intimate. Sophie had waited years for this, had built rules and walls to protect herself from the kind of heartbreak that had destroyed her mother. But this, Kaylin's body joined with hers, his eyes locked on hers with such intensity it made her soul ache, his hands gentle and claiming all at once. This was worth every moment of waiting. "Sophie," he gasped against her neck, his control fraying. "I can't, I need—" "Let go," she whispered, her own body building toward something overwhelming and inevitable. "I've got you. Let go." He buried his face in her neck and shattered, and Sophie followed him over the edge, her body clenching around his as waves of pleasure crashed through her. In the aftermath, they lay tangled together, hearts racing, skin slick with sweat, both of them stunned by the intensity of what had just happened. That was... Kaylin's voice was rough, awed. "Worth waiting for," Sophie finished with a shaky laugh. He propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with such tenderness that her eyes stung. "I've never felt anything like that. Ever. Neither have I. Though granted, I don't have much basis for comparison. You're the only comparison I'll ever need." He traced her lips with his thumb. "This, us, it's everything, Sophie. You're everything." She pulled him down for a long, slow kiss that promised there was more to explore, more to discover. A lifetime of nights like this ahead of them. They made love again later. Less awkward, more confident, building on what they'd learned. And then again, in the early morning hours, slow and sleepy and perfect. By the time dawn painted the Manhattan skyline in shades of gold and pink, Sophie lay in Kaylin's arms, feeling satisfied and sore and blissfully, completely happy. "No regrets?" he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Not a single one." She snuggled closer, drawing lazy patterns on his chest. "Though I might need a day to recover before we do that again." His laugh rumbled through his chest. "We have forever, Mrs. Vance. No rush." Mrs. Vance. The name settled over her like a warm blanket, like coming home. "I like the sound of that," she admitted. "So do I." He tightened his arms around her. "More than I can possibly say." They dozed for a while, wrapped in each other in contentment, until Kaylin's phone chimed with a text. He checked it and smiled. "Marcus says Leo had a great time at the sleepover, but is asking when we're coming to get him." "Already?" Sophie laughed. "We've been married less than 12 hours. He missed you." Kaylin kissed her forehead. "We both did, even when you were sleeping right next to me." Sophie's heart swelled. "Let's go get our son." "Our son." The words felt natural, right? like they'd always been meant to say them. Kaylin's eyes went suspiciously bright. Yeah, let's go get our son and start our life. They showered together, which led to more kissing and gentle touching and laughter, and dressed slowly, savoring these last moments of their honeymoon before real life resumed. But as they left the hotel and headed to pick up Leo, Sophie realized that real life didn't feel like a burden or an ending. It felt like the beginning of everything she'd ever wanted. 1 year later, Sophie stood in the doorway of their new house, not the cold penthouse with its marble and steel, but a warm, sprawling home in Westchester with a backyard and rooms filled with light, and watched the scene unfolding before her with a heart so full it felt like it might burst. Kaylin was on the grass with Leo, both of them laughing as they tried to fly a kite that kept diving into the ground. Her husband, that word still gave her a thrill, looked nothing like the controlled, armored businessman who'd shown up at her apartment a year and a half ago. He was in jeans and an old t-shirt, his hair mussed, his face lit with genuine joy. And Leo, beautiful, brilliant Leo, was talking animatedly about wind currents and angles, his vocabulary and confidence growing every day. He still had his challenges, still needed his sensory tools and quiet spaces, but he was thriving in a way that made Sophie's throat tight with pride and love. "Sophie," Leo called out, "come help. Dad doesn't understand physics." "I understand physics just fine," Kaylin protested, pulling his son into a playful headlock. "I just don't speak it fluently like you do, genius." Sophie laughed and walked across the grass to join them, and Kaylin immediately wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her against his side. "Hey, beautiful," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Hey yourself, handsome." She leaned into him, breathing in his familiar scent and feeling the solid warmth of his body against hers. A year of marriage, and the novelty still hadn't worn off. If anything, their physical connection had deepened, the initial fumbling giving way to a profound intimacy that continued to surprise and delight them both. "How's the shop?" Kaylin asked. "Busy, amazing, overwhelming in the best way." Sophie smiled. Reed & Co. had expanded beyond her wildest dreams. Wholesale accounts with major retailers, a thriving online presence, and enough demand that she'd hired 3 employees to help with production. "I got a call from a school district in California. They want to order sensory kits for every special education classroom." "That's incredible." Kaylin's eyes shone with pride. Not ownership, not control, just genuine happiness for her success. "It is." Sophie looked up at him. "Thank you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself. You did all the work. I just provided startup capital. You provided faith." She touched his face. That was worth more than any amount of money. Leo tugged on her sleeve. "Can we have dinner outside, like a picnic?" "Absolutely." Sophie ruffled his hair. "Want to help me make sandwiches? Can I put peanut butter and jelly in layers?" "As many layers as you want, sweetheart." They headed inside together, leaving Kaylin to wrestle with a kite, and Sophie felt that familiar sense of rightness settle over her. This was her life now. This house filled with laughter instead of silence. This child who called her Mom without hesitation. This man who'd proven day after day that love wasn't about grand gestures, but about showing up, choosing each other, building something real. As she and Leo worked in the kitchen, him carefully spreading peanut butter in precise layers while she sliced fruit, Sophie caught sight of the photo on the refrigerator. Their wedding day, the 3 of them wrapped in each other's arms, smiling like they'd won the lottery. In a way, they had. Later, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, they sat together on a blanket in the backyard. Leo between them, contentedly eating his elaborate sandwich. Kaylin's hand resting on Sophie's knee, the kite finally flying successfully in the distance. "This is nice," Leo said through a mouthful of peanut butter. "I like our family." "Me too, buddy." Kaylin squeezed Sophie's hand. "Me too." Sophie looked at her husband, at the man who'd been so desperate to control everything that he'd nearly lost what mattered most. Who'd learned to be vulnerable, to trust, to build with instead of for. Who'd shown her that not all men were like the ones who destroyed her mother. That some men knew how to honor a promise, to fight for love, to choose partnership over power. "What are you thinking?" Kaylin asked softly. Sophie smiled. "That you built a fortress to protect your son, but all he needed was a family, and all you needed was someone to help you tear down the walls." His eyes went suspiciously bright. "Poetic. I learned from the best." She leaned over Leo to kiss him, soft and sweet and full of promise. When she pulled back, Kaylin was looking at her with such love, it made her breath catch. "I love you," he said simply. "More every day. I didn't think that was possible. But you keep proving me wrong." "I love you too." Sophie rested her head on his shoulder. "Thank you for seeing me, for making me believe I was worth being seen. Always." His arm came around her, solid and sure. "For the rest of our lives, Sophie, you'll always be seen." As darkness fell and the first stars appeared overhead, they stayed there, a family of 3, wrapped in blankets and each other, watching the sky change and knowing that whatever challenges came, they'd face them together. No more fortresses, no more walls, just love, trust, and the courage to be vulnerable. Just a family, finally and forever whole. 2 years later, Sophie stood in the nursery of their Westchester home, one hand on her very pregnant belly, the other adjusting the mobile hanging over the crib. Handmade sensory toys, her designs, naturally, spun slowly in the afternoon breeze from the open window. "Sophie?" Kaylin's voice called from downstairs. "The doctor's office called. They can move up your appointment if we leave now." "Coming." She took one last look at the room. Pale yellow walls, soft lighting, everything chosen for calm and comfort, and smiled. Their daughter would be here in 3 weeks. Amelia Rose Vance, named after Sophie's mother. Leo was beyond excited about becoming a big brother, already making plans for all the things he'd teach his sister. He'd been practicing being gentle with his baby cousin, reading books about sibling relationships, preparing in his methodical, beautiful way. And Kaylin, her husband, had spent the entire pregnancy treating Sophie like she was made of spun glass, attending every appointment, reading every book, oscillating between excitement and terror in a way that was both endearing and exhausting. As Sophie descended the stairs, she found him waiting with her coat, his eyes immediately going to her belly with that expression of wonder he still got even after 7 months. "How are my girls?" he asked, helping her into the coat. "Your girls are fine. Your wife would like to stop being treated like an invalid, though." He grinned. "Not a chance, Mrs. Vance. I waited too long for this to not appreciate every second. Even the swollen ankles and emotional breakdowns. Especially those." He pulled her gently into his arms, careful of her belly. "Because they mean we're bringing another perfect person into the world. Someone who'll be half you, half me, and entirely ours." Sophie's eyes prickled with the easy tears that had become her constant companion. "You're going to make me cry again." "Good." He kissed her forehead. "I love when you cry happy tears." As they headed out to the car, Leo already buckled in the back seat, chattering about baby names. Sophie caught sight of the reflection in the hallway mirror. A family, not perfect, but real. built on trust and vulnerability, and the courage to believe that love wasn't about control or acquisition, but about partnership and choice and showing up every single day. She'd been invisible once, a waitress drowning in debt and fear, convinced that protecting her heart was the same as protecting herself. But Kaylin had seen her, had chosen her, had proven that some rules were made to be honored, some walls were meant to come down, and some love stories were worth waiting for. "Ready?" he asked, opening the car door for her. Sophie looked at her husband, their son, her swollen belly carrying their daughter, and felt a peace so profound it stole her breath. "Ready?" she said. And she was, for all of it, forever. Thank you for spending time with me. I hope you enjoyed the journey. Kindly subscribe and drop a comment. I love to know you better and be on the watch out for the next journey of strength, perseverance, and love. It should be on your feed soon.